Right. Okay. So this is Anthony French with an H, and so I was born and raised in Brighton, England, south of London, and I went to Cambridge as a student in up in, which is more or less northeast of London, in 1939. Just couple of weeks after the war was declared. So I'd just finished my secondary school and helped in the reception of refugees, kids from London who were being billeted in various supposedly safer places around the south coast. It never made much sense to me that they would billet kids more or less in the path between Germany and England, but it worked out. Brighton never suffered any serious damage. But I did go through London in vacations between Brighton and Cambridge, or reverse, and so I had occasion to stay nights in London, but no more than that, so that I didn't ever really experience the Blitz in any direct way. This was at the time when the V1 buzz bombs were coming over, and so there were alarms, and everybody would go into the basement until we heard them cut out and knew that they were about to fall somewhere, but it probably wasn't going to be us. Cambridge itself was almost immune from bombing. I don't think it was ever deliberately bombed. The only bombing at Cambridge that I remember, well, a couple of instances. One was an incendiary bomb that accidentally came in through the lab that I worked in and ended up in a sink or something like that. It never created any fire. And there was one real casualty when a young research man working with the cyclotron was actually killed. But again, that was not deliberately bombing. I think it would have been a German bomber that jettisoned its bombs on its way back to Germany if it had been attacked and was trying to escape. But otherwise, Cambridge was very quiet. I think there was probably a tacit understanding that Heidelberg and Cambridge and Oxford were not going to be used as targets.
Tell me about who did you study with, and or what?
Okay. In Cambridge there was a degree program called the Natural Sciences Tripos. The first part of it was mathematics, physics, chemistry, and usually some other subject, and I took mineralogy. Those first 2 years, I was just following a standard undergraduate science program. However, one thing of interest to you might be that during my second year, C.P. Snow, whose name is probably familiar to you, he still was, I guess, a fellow of a Cambridge College, Christ's College, and he was in charge of the allocation of scientific manpower. And during my second year, he came up to Cambridge and spent 3 days interviewing all of these science engineering undergraduates to decide where they might go for war work. And so I remember very vividly Snow interviewed me, and it turned out that he'd been an examiner for the entrance scholarship exams that I'd taken in order to get a scholarship to go to Cambridge. And the first thing he said to me was, "Why didn't you get a first class in the end of in your exams at the end of the first year?" And I very arrogantly said to him, I was bored, which was because to get up to the level of the entrance scholarships, you had gone way beyond normal high school work, and it was in a sense true that I think that was part of the reason for my not doing better. Anyway, I had to pull my socks up. And so at the end of the second year, I got a first, all right. But anyway, I think he may have been at the base of deciding, well, where anybody went when they got their degree, and perhaps I was beginning to be steered towards physics, and nuclear physics in particular. But it really started seriously towards the end of my third and last year for the bachelor's degree. And another friend, a physics major friend of mine, and I went to see Sir Lawrence Bragg, who was then head of the Cavendish lab. And we asked him about any possibility of a job when we graduated. And he was completely non-committal, but we got the message in. And as I mentioned in my talk, I'd had this fellow Egon Bretscher, whom I found a very interesting and exciting lecturer on basic nuclear physics, and so he knew that, and he knew me personally, and I guess that helped us to have him decide that I and this other fellow Michael Poole would join his group as soon as we graduated. But that was the nearest to being directly drafted for the war that I ever knew about.
So when you waited and when you got your degree, then you were invited to become part of the Tuvalu project?
That was, as I mentioned in the talk, it was just a couple of weeks before the end of the term and the final exams that Bretscher told me, please come and report to me a week or two after the degree program was finished, and report to him at his office in the Cavendish lab. Well, tube alloys was just a cover name, of course, for Britain's atomic bomb program, and it was meant to be as meaningless as possible, so as to not point to anything. But it was then the organization that was set up as a direct consequence of the key paper that was written by Rudolf Peierls and Otto Frisch, proposing very specifically that a bomb could be made out of separated uranium-235. Well, Peierls was not somebody I knew except by reputation at all. But he was known as a distinguished theoretical physicist, German, and a refugee. And so he had come to England in the mid-1930s, I guess. I'm not sure where he was at the time. It might have been Bristol, the University of Bristol. But anyway, he was certainly settled in England. Otto Frisch is famous for the visit he made to his aunt in Sweden, who was an Austrian refugee who had been working with Hahn and Strassmann in Berlin, and after the Anschluss, when Germany took over Austria, she felt very unsafe in Berlin, and she was helped by a Dutch physicist friend, Dirk Koster, I think it was, who enabled her to travel by train to Holland, and then almost immediately to go over to Sweden, where she spent the rest of the war. And Frisch was visiting her at Christmas time in Sweden, and Meitner had been in correspondence with Hahn and Strassmann while they were trying to puzzle out the funny things that they seemed to be finding through chemistry about the bombardment of uranium with neutrons. And Hahn was an extremely good chemist, and he finally insisted that what they had was not some nucleus heavier than uranium as a result of adding neutrons. This was plain barium in the middle of the periodic table, and it just had to be so. And Frisch and Meitner talked about this and came up with this notion, which in retrospect was maybe not all that surprising, that a uranium nucleus with an extra neutron added might be a sort of top-heavy and simply split in two. And so that was the origin of the understanding of what was really happening. And it was Frisch himself who, through a biologist friend, decided that to call this process nuclear fission, in analogy with what happened biologically when cells split up. And so Frisch and Meitner really started the whole fission business through their discovery. And there's a famous story about this that Frisch, having had this idea, went back to his lab in England. I guess by then it was in Liverpool, and he set up a very simple apparatus to actually observe fission happening with the help of an ionization device, ionization chamber, and measured the big electrical pulses that corresponded to the release of 200 million electron volts of energy when the uranium nucleus broke apart in that way. And a famous story that Niels Bohr was about to go to Copenhagen. Maybe Frisch himself actually was in Copenhagen at the time, come to think of it, and had sought refuge in Bohr's Institute. Anyway, Bohr was about to make a trip to the United States, but agreed with Frisch that he would hold off from telling anybody in the United States about it until Frisch had had the chance to submit a paper about his discoveries. This was before any plans to make a bomb, just the discovery of fission itself. And Bohr was going to a conference in the USA, and somehow he sort of forgot that he was not supposed to tell anybody. And as soon as he got to the States, he mentioned it, and then American physicists, all of them, raced to their labs to verify the phenomenon. And so the cat was out of the bag, but Frisch did get his paper published as the first official report on the phenomenon. Anyway, so Frisch and Peierls then got together and wrote a report suggesting the possibility of an explosive device made from uranium fission. There was another component to that which is perhaps not so well known, and that is that another essential element was that in fission neutrons are released, and that was discovered by Joliot in France. So that was the other, until then, a missing piece that made a chain reaction possible.
And wasn't it their paper that also talked about the use of, there was a weapon that would be possible?
Well, that was a separate thing. I mean, the original paper was just the sheer discovery of fission. That was an academic discovery. But later than that, then, the next year, when by then Britain was at war, and the possibility of making a fission weapon began to be seriously considered. And so Peierls and Frisch wrote this report, a two-part report. One was in rather general terms about the idea that there could be such a weapon. The other was putting in some numbers to suggest that, yes, with a few kilograms of separated uranium-235, such a weapon could be made. And it was not so huge that it was out of the question.
And what was the third part?
That was the two parts of the paper. I mean, one was that in principle this was a reasonable idea, and the second was putting in numbers to see quantitatively what it would mean, what it would require.
Let's see. So did you, I'm trying to get this set up here. So when you got to Cavendish Laboratory, was Sir James Chadwick there, and how did this?
No, well, Chadwick was.
Could you start again and say Sir James Chadwick, because people won't hear my question.
No, okay, I see. Okay, all right. Well, the first thing to happen then, after Frisch and Piles submitted their report perhaps to Chadwick, I'm not sure, but anyway, it found its way into official circles in London, and the decision was then made that this was something to be followed up, and so a special committee was set up called the Maud Committee, M-A-U-D, which one can read about in all histories of this atomic project, that would pursue the matter and develop definite plans for Britain to get into the business of trying to make an atomic bomb. Then there were several universities that were involved in this way. So the Cavendish lab in Cambridge was one, and Chadwick's own institution, Liverpool, was another. I don't know how many others were involved. I think probably the University of Birmingham too, which had been significantly involved with the development of radar at the time. Anyway, from this small beginning, the Tube Alloys organization then developed plans to involve industry and to promote the development of a definite plan.
Can you tell us about the Maud report and who that was intended for, and then how that whole...
Well, I guess it was essentially a report for use by the British government, depending upon whatever they wanted to do about it, if anything. I can't pretend to detailed knowledge of that. I mean, I didn't even know about the Maud report at the time, of course. It was all secret. All I know is from that time is that a project was formed, and that one aspect of it was the creation of two research groups at Cambridge University, one to work on the fission of uranium by fast neutrons, which would then be the basis for designing a bomb, and the other with slow neutrons to make possible the design of a nuclear reactor, which could be used, the neutrons in which could be used to make plutonium out of uranium plus neutrons. There was something very important here, that the problem of separating the isotope uranium-235 from the much more abundant uranium-238 was horrendously difficult, because these nuclei are very similar in mass and identical electrically, essentially, and to separate them just by projecting them into a magnetic field and having them follow slightly different semicircular paths made for only the tiniest separation between them, and to get pure uranium-235 when there was 70 times as much uranium-238 was incredibly hard. Whereas if uranium-238 captured one neutron and became a chemically different substance, plutonium, that once it entered the realm of chemistry, then the separation of the uranium from the plutonium was relatively very much easier. So and it was my boss, Egon Bretscher, I think, was the first person in Britain to recognize the possibility that the plutonium made in this way was a possible bomb material, that it might undergo fission itself, that led to the idea of making a major reactor to create plutonium and then chemically separate it from everything else. There was one intermediary there which I should mention just for precision, namely that the first thing that you get after bombarding, after a uranium-238 nucleus captures a neutron, is it forms the next element up in the periodic table beyond uranium, which is neptunium. And then after that, it was following the labeling of the planets, you see. The next one after Neptune is Pluto, and that was relatively stable, whereas the neptunium was quite short-lived. But the plutonium had a lifetime of thousands of years, and so it was essentially a durable material that could be the basis of a bomb.
So what was, let's see, you're now part of the Tube Alloy project, formally.
As of June of 1942, yes.
Okay. Do you want to, start with that and tell us about what it was like and what you did?
All right. So here's the man who tutored me in my last year at Cambridge, to Egon Bretscher, and I'm being told to check in with him, just take a week off after my getting my degree, and then go and join his group. So then I go to his office, and he tells me then about the existence of the project. And first of all, because I had no idea that anything like that was going on behind the other door in his office that I hadn't noticed really before. But there I was, and immediately he showed me into this, what I thought of as a very large room with this elaborate contraption, a nuclear accelerator to go up to 1,000,000 volts, and which was going to be used to accelerate hydrogen, ions of heavy hydrogen, deuterium, to go down vertically through a hole into a research room underneath, where they would strike what was called a target. There was a magnet to bend the beam around so that it was now going horizontally, and it would go along a horizontal tube, strike a so-called target, which was no more than a thin plate of material inside the vacuum system, and the collision of the one deuterium ion with the deuterium atoms in the target would lead to a nuclear reaction that produced helium-3 and a neutron, or hydrogen-3 and a proton. And the one that was of interest for the nuclear physics was the one that made helium-3 and a neutron, which then, and with several million electron volts of energy, and that could be used then to cause fission in a uranium sample that we had in a detector a few feet away from the target of the machine. And so our task was to get specific information about how these neutrons of different energies, ranging from about 500,000 electron volts to 5 million electron volts, how they would interact with uranium nuclei to cause fission in the uranium. And that was really the essence of the project at that time, just to measure the probability that these fast neutrons would cause fission or as measured in the more conventional terminology of nuclear physics, what was the cross-section for the effective cross-section for a collision between a fast neutron and a uranium nucleus that would result in another neutron coming out and enabling us to produce further fissions from the neutrons that came out in that way.
So this work, you said you began in June of 42.
Yes.
To put it in a time, we know about Enrico Fermi's.
Yeah.
So this was before the...
before the first Chicago pile, that's right, 6 months before. About which, of course, again, we knew nothing, at least in... that was the mystery of it all. I mean, and that's why, you know, it seems so unreal. Here we were in Cambridge in a perfectly ordinary lab working with small amounts of this material and that, and having no sense that there was any real practical likelihood that this would amount to anything. But some people who were more senior to us, obviously, like my tutor Egon Bretscher himself, they clearly felt that possibility existed, and they were wholeheartedly engaged in working on it.
How did things change from your project being isolated and remote from the United States efforts? When did the two come together?
It took a long time. There was this other group working at the Cavendish, but working independently on the production of fission by slow neutrons, and that was it as far as people like myself were concerned. We didn't know much at all about contact even with other small research groups elsewhere in England. There were hints that big industry might be involved, but we never saw anything directly about that. That would have been in the hands of the Maud Committee and groups like that, official groups, who were seeing everything from the top down. But until I was sent up to meet with Chadwick in London, not too long before I was actually sent to the States, there was very little indeed that I knew about the size of the project or where it was heading.
So what month was it that you had this meeting with Chadwick?
It was...
Could you just remember to say, I met Sir James Chadwick in London, because they won't hear my question.
No, I see, okay. I'd been working on the development of this apparatus of mine to measure more effectively the production of neutrons in the target of our machine. And so there were this little research group that I was a member of, with Bretscher himself and two other junior physicists at the time, shortly added to by one more young person who graduated in physics the next year, and a couple of radiochemists who were important for doing chemistry on the uranium, and a technician and so on, and a very valuable man who kept the 1 million volt set working and mending the components of it, which were not replaceable at all from the original manufacturers, because that was in Holland and completely cut off from us now that the war was on. Well, it was only after a year or so of doing this kind of work that in something like February of 1944, so it was a year and a half at any rate, Bretscher was informed about the fact that this work was going to be transferred to North America, and all that we junior people knew about it was simply that there had been some important changes, and some members of these two groups at the Cavendish lab that were doing research on fission would some of us would be going to North America. And it was then that we learned that the slow neutron people, those of them that continued to stay with the project and didn't stay in England, would be going to Canada, and that Bretscher, at least himself, was going to go off to North America in February of 1944, and that we would be due to follow him in due course. It was not until about that time that my young colleague, or equally young colleague, Michael Poole, and I went up to London to be interviewed by Sir James Chadwick, who would come down from Liverpool, which was his headquarters, to deal with the top officials in tube alloys, which were in London, and talk to us about what might be happening to us.
So how did this conversation go between you and Chadwick?
Chadwick was a very taciturn man. He was given to sitting for minutes puffing at his pipe before saying anything. So we didn't learn much from him. One amusing thing that happened actually was, well, he more or less told us that we were going to a place in America, and he said, now the winters are rather severe, and you better get yourself a really good overcoat. That was about the size of it. I followed his advice and bought an expensive tweed overcoat, which I never actually wore. New Mexico weather wasn't quite that severe at all, even on the top of the mesa when I finally got to it. But anyhow, so what happened in essence was Chadwick told us a little bit about the project, but not much. I mean, he didn't assume, I think, well, he knew what we'd been working on. He didn't really go outside my own knowledge of what was going on at that point. But he made it clear that things were being moved to North America, and that was that. And then he told us to go home and wait for further instructions. And so I went back to Cambridge and continued making these fission cross-section measurements for the next 6 months.
So when was it that you got your further instructions?
Well, then it must have been just in early October 1944 when we were told, please come back to London as soon as possible, and you'll be going to the USA. And so what we did was we just take the train up there. We're met by one of the medium-level officials in the tube alloys management, and they gave us tickets, put us on, and we had to go to the American embassy or passports were picked up for us. I don't remember now how it went, but anyway, we were equipped with our passports and train tickets to take the train from London down to southwest England, to a harbour, and Poole Harbour it was, P-O-O-L-E, where we reported in and were more or less immediately transferred to this flying boat, very much like the Pan American flying boats that had been used for transport of passengers for some years, and simply went and boarded the plane. I guess we were taken out by boat to this plane because it was not you couldn't just walk onto an aircraft like that when it was a flying boat. It was just sitting in the water. Anyway, so we were shipped out to this thing and boarded it, and very soon afterwards, I guess, took off from the harbour and were flown to the port for such aircraft on the Shannon River on the west of Ireland, and that was the first stop. And so everybody got off at that point. We walked up the beach to a refreshment centre, saw some very good cakes and food and things like that we hadn't seen for some long time. And then I suppose we were on the ground for an hour or so. I don't remember now how exactly it was. Anyhow, then reboarded the flying boat and started the trip across the Atlantic. And at a guess, I would say there were possibly something like 20 or 30 people on board. I don't recall exactly that. But the plane was equipped with bunks. Part of the reason for our delay in going was that there'd been a severe gale in the Atlantic, and so we'd been sort of holding ourselves ready for about a week in London before we actually got the call to make this trip. And then once it was underway, we were in the thick of it, and so we took off one afternoon late one afternoon from Shannon, and began this Atlantic crossing, which in the teeth of a headwind took 17 hours to get to Newfoundland. And there we arrived, and again went ashore and for breakfast. And again, one of those wonderful surprises, we got 2 eggs with breakfast. I mean, we'd been living on 1 egg a week in England with the rationing that went on, and so everything was looking very luxurious for us. Anyhow, so after that breakfast, then there was one more flight down the down the east coast, southeast coast of the USA, down to. I decided after looking at maps it must have been.
Yeah, why don't we stop? There's too many people coming. Talked about the 2 eggs a day. Yeah. So make sure you describe that. People always like to hear about the food, the rationing.
I see. Yes. All right. So during our stop then at Shannon, we went ashore and had some really good food, the best we'd seen in a long time. But back on the ship then for the final leg of the flight down to a little bit, close to Washington. I wouldn't have known at the time whether it was north or south, but anyway, near Washington, landing on the water, and then a short train ride up to Washington itself. And there we were turned loose for a couple of hours before we had to report back for taking a train. So here we were walking around in Washington, and after 5 years of living with the blackout in England, it was just amazing to see bright lights and shops and so on. It was a different world altogether. And anyhow, we then went to the station. We must have been met by another British government official providing us with instructions and tickets to take a train to Chicago. And that was an overnight train to Chicago. I should mention that by this time, or even before we crossed the Atlantic, we'd been joined by one of Sir James Chadwick's own students from Liverpool, so that we were together at the beginning of this transatlantic journey down in southwest England. And the 3 of us then, Michael Poole and James Hughes it was, and myself, and so we were now about to go on an overnight train trip to Chicago. So we arrived there the next morning, and then we just wandered around the city. Well, we were taken by taxi to a different railway station, which was going to be our starting point for the trip out west. And so it would have been late afternoon, I think. I have a feeling it was beginning to get dark before we actually got well underway on the train, which was the California Limited train that went all the way across to Los Angeles, I guess. And so we set out, and we had, the three of us now were in what was called, I think, a compartment in the train. It was just 3 bunks and toilet facilities, and with some assistant on the train who set up our beds when it came time to sleep. And we had the interesting experience of actually dining on an American train, which was, again, very impressive. I mean, what seemed like terrific food. And we got ourselves organized for sleep. I seem to remember that before we actually went to bed, as it were, we were simply observing the countryside as we rode along. But then after that, it was the plains of Kansas, I suppose, that occupied an enormous amount of time. I do remember one thing very vividly, and that was seeing a farmer out in his fields smoking a cigar. Now, to me in England, anybody who smoked a cigar was a rich man, whereas here it was apparently something that was quite taken for granted. There was nothing very remarkable about it. And anyhow, but apart from that, it was these endless prairies and enormous fields compared to anything I'd seen in England before. And I wouldn't like to say where it was that we stopped en route, but the Santa Fe, the California Limited, was not one of the crack trains. It was a good train, but I'm sure it had many more stops than the California Zephyr and things like that that were doing the same route. Anyhow, after 2.5 days on the train, we finally arrived then at this station called Lamy in the middle of nowhere, and nothing more than what looked like a little shack and an army car with a driver waiting for us. And so that was the thing that took us into Santa Fe, and that was a trip of about 15 miles, I think, and to report in at the famous 109 East Palace Road in Santa Fe, where every new entrant to Los Alamos checked in. Now, I know I read a lot about Dorothy McKibben, who ran that office. I have no specific memory of meeting her, but I must have done. And anyhow, we were not immediately whisked up onto the hill. We were turned loose in Santa Fe for a couple of hours or thereabouts. And I do remember that I saw this as a kind of goodbye to civilization, and took advantage of the freedom to go and buy some postcards and send them through the US mail right there in Santa Fe before we went up into the hills. And anyway, so then we arrived at Los Alamos and were met there by a senior member of the British mission who'd already been there for some months, of Philip Moon, who was a professor of physics in Birmingham, I believe, but had been already part of the work at Los Alamos for some months. And so we arrived there, and we must have been taken or steered by him to the dormitory that we were going to be living in.
So describe what that was like.
Well, it was muddy and rainy, and not very pleasant at all that first night. But I guess we must have had some sort of a meal. Again, I don't remember. But we were ready next morning to begin our acquaintance with the place. And one of the first things, of course, was for us to reconnect with Egon Bretscher, who'd been our boss back in Cambridge. And so we met with him, and then I got this huge surprise that he wasn't working on nuclear fission anymore, that he had joined forces with Edward Teller and was going to provide the experimental component of the project that Teller himself had been busy with ever since he went to Los Alamos himself, namely to work towards the possibility of a fusion bomb with using not fission but the reactions of the very lightest elements, the hydrogen isotopes, that might be a source of an even more powerful weapon, which would have to be ignited by a uranium fission bomb. But Teller himself was not interested in working on fission himself. I think he considered himself a candidate to be head of the theoretical division at Los Alamos, but Oppenheimer never seriously considered that. He chose Hans Bethe, which was by far the wisest choice, and so Teller was sort of out on a limb in a sense. And because he had not shown himself to be cooperative about the working on the fission project, Oppenheimer simply let him go ahead, form his own little theoretical group, which he'd been doing for some months before I got there. But there was no experimental program to back it up. And so Bretscher decided to attach himself to this thing in Fermi's F division, as it was called, a special projects division, and then begin setting up from scratch an experimental program that would do some of the work to get the nuclear data that would be required to actually design a fusion weapon. Excuse me.
Well, we'll go back to. Why don't we go back, just because I don't want to miss the chance to get you to talk about this. Did you see that the collaborative efforts with the United States were essential to make this?
There was no question about that. The condition of Britain during the war, with the shortage of supplies, the bombing, everything else, would have militated against any full development of fission as a weapon, I think. So it became very clear to me beyond that as soon as we set foot in Los Alamos, here was something which was equipped to possibly make it work. Whereas in Britain, with the fragmentation of the research efforts there was no real focus for it. Just individual university departments doing their academic research, and industrial firms with no particular background in the kind of engineering that would be required. I knew that there were tentative efforts on the use of diffusion, for example, to separate the isotopes of uranium, but there was nothing compelling or even big enough in scale to suggest that this would go anywhere. So that I would say that it was very evident once we got to the States that this was an order of magnitude, or several orders of magnitude, bigger, and that's what you would need to get anywhere with it.
Can you, as you did this morning, talk about a couple of things you saw at Los Alamos that were impressive?
Okay, well, the quantity and quality of the technical development there was really remarkable. Both the equipment itself and the personnel. This first visit to the labs at Los Alamos, there was the Harvard cyclotron. There were 2 Van de Graaff machines from the University of Wisconsin. There was a medium-sized Cockcroft-Wharton apparatus of the much scaled up from the original Cockcroft and Wharton machine that pioneered the study of nuclear reactions in 1932. Then all the evidence of tremendous amount of material support for all of this stuff, and the people. I mean, the fact that here there were scientists in abundance, hundreds of them, all collected together to work on this one thing, and that's what it would have needed, and could never have happened in Britain, in my opinion.
That's good. What about, I think at the talk too, you talked about the colloquia. So tell us about how Robert Oppenheimer ran the laboratory.
Okay, yes. Well, Oppenheimer was a most interesting study, looking back especially, when you think that he was only 38 when he became head of the Los Alamos lab. He was a theorist. He had no record in administering anything, as far as I know, and yet, as it turned out, he couldn't have been a better person for the job. And it is very amazing to me also, and this has been written about quite often, I'm sure, that it was General Groves who chose him to do this particular job. Now, Groves, the civilian scientists, they hated his guts, generally speaking, although they didn't really see that much of him. But he was clearly very autocratic. But when you look back at the project as a whole, you have to admire him. I mean, he had responsibility not just for Los Alamos. That was a small component of it. He was in charge with of this immense technical and industrial development that led to the creation of the electromagnetic separation plant and the diffusion separation plants in Tennessee, and of the reactors in Hanford, and everything else connected with the project. I mean, it was, and so he was propelled into this somewhat against his will. Initially, apparently, he had greater ambitions at the time to get overseas service. He thought this was a bit of a downgrading for him, but he was a very proficient organizer, as he'd already shown, I think, in connection with non-military projects on behalf of the Army. And he was clearly the right man for the job, but also it is very interesting indeed that he would have selected Oppenheimer to run the show, especially as has been pointed out in many books. Oppenheimer's political credentials were very questionable. Definitely a communist sympathizer when he was younger, anyway, and as I say, with no particular record of administration, and yet he had a very quick apprehension of any new idea that came up, and turned out to have remarkable personnel management skills, which he'd never, I think, particularly practiced before. So Oppenheimer himself was an essential component of the whole business, as it turned out. And then to come to the particular vehicle that he used to share the knowledge about the project through the weekly colloquia, that was an absolutely essential piece of the action. And Groves, with a typical need-to-know or limitation and need-to-know attitude to these things, wanted to compartmentalize the work. And Oppenheimer said, no, that just won't work. You've got to have the scientists talking to one another, scientists in different areas of research, physics, chemistry, explosives, so forth, metallurgy. These scientists are going to be mutually helpful, and so Groves finally accepted that, and so here came these weekly colloquia at which somebody or other would report on some aspect of the research going on, and inviting comments and opinions and suggestions from the audience. And so that, without that, I really doubt that the project would have succeeded.
Did you see any of the colloquia? I mean,
oh yes.
Okay, so tell me, how were they conducted? What was it like?
Well, there was nothing particularly exciting about any particular colloquium, I suppose. I mean, you went there, and then some person working on a specific field of the research would talk about it. I particularly remember some of the discussion about the use of the development of the explosives. Once the idea that a gun type model for plutonium was not going to work because it couldn't, because the firing of one lump of plutonium at another simply wasn't fast enough with an ordinary gun. You had to have different ways altogether of dealing with the problem, and so Seth Neddermeyer initially had come up with the suggestion of an implosion in which you surrounded a sphere, let's say, or a cylinder or something of plutonium and compressed it with a violent chemical explosion until it became, because as a result of being compressed, it was able to be pushed through into a supercritical state that produced then the nuclear explosion, and then that all could happen within a very small fraction of a second, or a thousandth of a second, or less, and this was the only route that would allow plutonium to be used for making of a bomb. So one would go to a colloquium about this, and somebody would be talking about how to produce a particular assembly of explosives that would do the trick. And so there were experiments going all the time on trying out different configurations of explosives, together with electronic detonation that would have to be very accurate and very fast to make the explosion do what it was intended to. And so there were all sorts of problems that arose with that. It was a long time before it was decided that a simple solid sphere of plutonium was the way to do it. People initially thought of a hollow sphere, for example, which would be more easily compressed. But there were all sorts of difficulties with that. The implosion, it was very hard to make the implosion symmetrical and guaranteed. And so and one here heard colloquia about this, and once the decision to go with a simple solid sphere, then, well, exactly how is that going to go? What degree of compression are you going to get? How can you study the implosion as it proceeded with the help of very fast electronics? And so, every aspect of the program had to be examined and experimented with. And that was, that's the way these colloquia went. Somebody or other would be talking about some aspect, and you'd be learning about it.
These problems were also complex. What was the mood of Los Alamos? I mean, were you sort of nervous and anxious that it was going to come together? Were you?
Well, I think, that's right. I mean, of course, every group was doing its own thing as best it could, and it was understood all along that it was important to do this fast. Evidently, initially, when the whole fission bomb program was started, it was thought that perhaps it would be completed in time to be used in Germany, and it wasn't. And time was continuing to pass, and the Japanese were now in the war against the USA, and again, the sooner the better that something was actually achieved. So there was always the time pressure. I don't think, well, I suppose there was a lot of concern because I'm sure deadlines were set for every different aspect of this job. But the most people could do was to just do their best. The resources were terrific. The logistics, the supplies problem was huge. There must have been a really superb logistical system at work. That the atomic bomb project had top priority for the procurement of absolutely anything that they decided they needed or wanted, and without that, I mean, it would probably not have worked indeed. But it was well coordinated as far as I could ever tell. I know that for our little project, it was amazing. I mean, we would ask for something, not necessarily very modest, but which we would always get. There were terrific machine shops, and that was, of course, a crucial part of the whole job. Wonderful machine shops and really top-notch technicians. I mean, they wouldn't call themselves technicians. I guess they'd call themselves, what, instrument makers? I'm not sure. That sounds too as though you deal with small things, but anyway, any level of top-notch engineering was available for this. Everything, and when you look, I mean, it absorbed a significant fraction, I should think, of all of the industrial productivity of the country.
Let's see. Maybe we should get your take on your fellow British mission colleague, Klaus Fuchs.
Oh yes, all right. Yes. Well, I had never met Fuchs before being at Los Alamos. I think it was Klaus Emil Julius Fuchs, I believe, K-E-J. That sounds right to me. So here he was, a German, I suppose, the son of a Lutheran minister, I believe, and he became a communist at a quite young age in Germany, and became an ardent anti-Nazi, and he had a sister who was not exactly assassinated by the Nazis, but I think who was hounded by them and finally committed suicide. So he had very strong political views and ideological sympathy with communism, and was a member of an active young communist league, I think, in Germany. And he became, in fact, a target for people who wanted to get rid of the communists. And he was in genuine danger for his own life, and he escaped then from Germany to Britain. I'm not sure whether he spent any time elsewhere in between, but anyway, he ended up in England and went to work, I guess, with or for Peierls, and worked initially perhaps at the University of Bristol. I'm not sure about that either. Anyhow, there he was in Britain, still harbouring his strong communist sympathies. The war was on, and after the collapse of the Russo-German Pact, and when Russia simply became one of the Allies, he evidently felt that it was entirely justified that he helped the Russians in the war effort, the common effort against Germany. So he had strong ideological bases for doing what he did. As I said, I mentioned I first met him fairly late in the war, I suppose, but it would have been in meetings, occasional meetings among the British participants. And so I first met him probably through some social gathering or other at Los Alamos involving the Brits. Although I went to Los Alamos as a bachelor, I met a woman, a mathematician, who was working in the theatrical group under the immediate direction of Richard Feynman, but ultimately under Hans Bethe. And she was doing computational work in connection with the implosion, theory of implosion. And Fuchs was certainly known to her at that time already. And I know there was an occasion, and then I should say next, that so this woman, Naomi Livesey, and I became engaged to be married in April of 1945, I think, before the war was over. But then after the war was over, we got married in October of 1945. And she became acquainted, well, she was already then somewhat acquainted with Fuchs. And we were now living in a little prefabricated house at Los Alamos, no longer in a dormitory. And there was an occasion, I know, when there was a visitor to one of the British mission officials who didn't live at Los Alamos, but who was visiting Los Alamos, and we had him and Fuchs to dinner one night. And Fuchs hardly said a word all evening. He just sat there. He was, I think Eugenia Piles described him as penny in the slot, Fuchs, that if you asked him a question, you would get a monosyllabic kind of answer, and then nothing would happen until you asked another question. Well, Fuchs was very much like that. Anyway, so, but that was about the only interaction that I strongly remember directly with Fuchs. However, there came a later occasion, and I guess it must have been at Los Alamos, some sort of a party or other, and my wife started feeling faint, and Fuchs noticed this, and he immediately came over and helped her sit down and get to be feeling better again. And he was just very simpatico. And there was something else that I remember vividly, and that was, as you know, Feynman's wife died of TB, and I don't think my future wife and I were yet married, but we'd been out on a hike together or something, and we were coming back into town, into Los Alamos, and we saw Fuchs driving Feynman around the town, and Feynman was waving and smiling at people that he knew on the way. And it wasn't until later that we learned that his wife had died just a few hours previously. Fuchs was taking care of Feynman in that way to give him moral support. So I had pretty positive feelings about him as a human being. And so we continued to be acquainted with him, and then came this thing which got into some reports on Los Alamos, that when he was getting ready to make his final departure from Los Alamos, he wanted to get rid of his car, and we bought it, my wife and I, and then drove him down from Los Alamos to Santa Fe on his final departure. And then, even beyond that, we were going back, or going to England. I was going back to England. My wife was going to be in England for the first time. Fuchs himself had already got back to England before we did, because we took a tour in the west of the States before returning. Anyway, and then subsequently he had us as his guests to dinner at the boarding house where he lived in Abingdon near Oxford, and he had by that time then become a senior official at the new atomic energy establishment near Oxford. And I was the first 2 years back in England, I went to that same atomic energy establishment. Cockcroft had been recruiting people from Los Alamos from the moment that it became clear that the war was going to be over, and he was looking for personnel for his new establishment. And so we were able to continue seeing Fuchs, not very often, but anyway, it was a cordial personal relationship. And then Bretscher, incidentally, he became head of the physics division at this atomic energy establishment. So I had quite a bit of contact with Bretscher also. So after 2 years at the Hardwell establishment, I was offered a teaching position back at Cambridge University, where I'd done my undergraduate work. So I was now on the faculty at Cambridge. Although I didn't have anything further to do with atomic bombs, my subject of research was nuclear physics, and so I was now heading up a small succession of graduate students doing experimental in nuclear physics. And Bretscher would come across from Harwell from time to time. It was not a long train journey from Oxford to Cambridge, and I know that one day in 1950, it must have been, I think he was visiting the lab, and the news broke that Fuchs had been arrested as a spy. So that came as a tremendous shock to everybody. Fuchs had been accepted as a very acceptable member of the community, but apparently the FBI and I guess the British Secret Service also had been tending to close in on him, that somebody had been giving nuclear secrets away. And it turned out, I think, that Fuchs was indeed the major contributor, giving far more information than anybody else had done about what had really gone on at Los Alamos. Anyway, so Fuchs was duly arrested. I happened to be good friends with the chief of security at Harwell, a very nice man called Henry Arnold, and he became essentially the one person that Fuchs was really willing to talk to as a friend. So we got further information about Fuchs and from him, even though we were no longer at Harwell. And this Henry Arnold said he was really overwhelmed by the discovery that he'd had this spy living next to him. But he had been quite friendly with Fuchs up to that point, and Fuchs would not willingly talk very freely with anybody else. But once he was convicted and jailed, I think Arnold continued to see him.
McMahon Act. The Congress passed that disallowed exchange of any atomic information, even with the Allies?
Well, I think probably like most other people, I took a very dim view of it. But I must ask you to remember that because of my direct connection with America and American politics essentially ended when I went back to England only a few months after I left Los Alamos. So it was only something that I read about in the papers from time to time, but it was not as prominent in my thinking or experience as for most of the American friends that I'd had at the project. So it was something I followed with interest, but that was about all. The one thing, I mean, that I followed avidly was what was done to Oppenheimer when he lost his status as head of the Atomic Energy Commission, or whatever it was then called, and the really horrible treatment he got throughout that process. But as for the McMahon Act as such, I mean, I knew of it, but it was not a big thing in my own thoughts or experience.
So you had left the nuclear weapons war.
I left.
You no longer worked on nuclear weapons.
Absolutely not. No, and so I have not. I didn't follow them in any way. I found it horrifying that bombs much larger than the ones used on Japan were now being produced, and produced in huge numbers. I don't think any of us at Los Alamos could have conceived of that mushrooming of the nuclear weapons business. And it seemed such an incredible waste of resources, for one thing, and it would have been inconceivable, as somebody I think said at the discussion in the meeting here, that anybody would actually choose to engage in a nuclear war, because it would be a guarantee of your own destruction, almost certainly.
So how did you feel about the use of the atomic bomb on Japan?
It was just, well, I would say that I thought that the use of the first bomb was justified. I know that has been argued back and forth one way or another, but I think anybody who had a relative or friend serving in the Pacific would have been very concerned about what it would take to complete an invasion of Japan, and that the Japanese military were certainly no friends of ours, and Japan had been very aggressive, and therefore any reasonable weapon of war was justified. And once Germany had already been defeated and Japan was the main enemy, the atomic bomb had not been used, I couldn't see that it would be withheld after that tremendous development work. It would be used most likely on Japan, and was very soon. But I think that after the bombing of Hiroshima, many people at Los Alamos, including me, were really aghast that another bomb should have been dropped so soon after the first one, and Japan didn't. I mean, this is my personal feeling about it, that Japan was not given the chance to assimilate the importance and the nature of what had actually happened at Hiroshima, that I didn't feel that the dropping of a second bomb so soon was reasonable. On the other hand, it seemed most likely to me that in light of the immense effort that had gone to making the bomb, the plutonium bomb, as distinct from the uranium bomb, that surely the military would want to use it just to see how it worked, or to verify that it worked, because it was a far more difficult and complicated thing than the original uranium-235 bomb. So, in practical terms, it clearly made sense to the military, but I think it was not right to have followed up so quickly.
One other thing, since you worked closely with Edward Teller,
Mm-hmm.
and you mentioned that you were sort of aghast that we went on and built such an arsenal of, 1,000 times more destructive weapons. However, it was Edward Teller who was very much behind that and behind the creation of the Lawrence Livermore Laboratory and so forth. Do you see Teller's hand in all of this, or can you say something again? People won't hear my question, so if you want to just make some comment about what it was like to work with Edward Teller.
I see. Okay. Well, Teller was a very interesting man, and very aggressive, I suppose you might say. At least his personal characteristics were kind of aggressive. I mean, he had this rasping voice, he had these bushy eyebrows, he was very emphatic in his opinions, and he was single-minded in his desire to make fusion and bombs generally, I suppose. But there was this other side of him, as you know. He loved music, was an enthusiastic pianist, and made a point of having his piano hauled up to Los Alamos, where he could play whenever he needed to. He was a curiously divided man, but he was certainly absolutely obsessed with the notion that it was necessary to develop these bombs. Many people have commented that these Hungarians were, in particular, fiercely anti-Russian. So even beyond the end of the World War II, and Russia changed from being an ally to something very much to be feared, then that certainly helped to impel him to do everything he could to maintain the development of weapons like this. And of course, I mean, he was very successful. I mean, after all, he had his own lab essentially developed, the Livermore lab, so as to carry through what he thought needed to be done in a post-war world. So I saw him not moderately frequently, I guess, when he and Bretscher were working together in this basic research, but that was very different from what happened later, in the sense that Teller took off by himself, and with a lot of support, I suppose, from Ernest Lawrence too. I mean, I think they were very similarly minded about the need to develop atomic weapons further. Yes, Cockcroft, of course, had made himself famous through his early research on nuclear physics, played an important role, I think, in the development of radar in Britain during the war, but then was clearly involved in the planning for post-war Britain and the use of nuclear energy there, and so became head, I guess, of the atomic energy establishment at Harwell, and quickly turned to recruiting people from Los Alamos to try and go and join him. And so several of us I know from the Los Alamos labs ended up in the Harwell establishment. Well, Cockcroft was a bit like Chadwick in the sense that he was pretty taciturn, and I didn't get any strong impressions of his character, I must say. But he was benign, I think, but that was about all I could say.